Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second season of International Workshop on Environment, Sustainability, and Education. My name is Oren Pizmoni-Levy. I'm an associate professor at Teachers College and the director of the Center for Sustainable Futures. And I'm really happy that we are launching a second season together with my colleague, Daphne Gan from the Kibbutzim College of Education, Technology, and the Arts, and also from the Israeli Institute of Education for Sustainability. These two institutions are very generous in their support for this effort, and I'm using this opportunity to thank our leadership and administration for supporting this kind of work. We started this workshop in, I think it was March or April of 2020, a couple of weeks into the lockdown of COVID-19. As we realized that travels and conferences and meeting and socializing with like-minded colleagues is not going to happen in the coming year. And this little pilot became the first season of this international workshop. And then when Daphne said, oh, why don't we do another one? I said, sure. And I was very happy that very quickly we were able to get the resources we need and to have a line of speakers for this season. If you want to watch the recording of the first round, I invite you to go to the website of our center at tc.columbia.edu/sustainability. Under the resource tab, you'll find all the recording of this series. I know from colleagues that some of them are using the recording in addition to materials they assign in the syllabus. So you can watch it for yourself, but you can also use it as additional material in your curriculum. So feel free to do that. The materials is available for free, and we are not planning to take it off the website anytime soon. So this session is recorded. I'm asking everybody to keep their microphone muted throughout the talk, so we won't have any noise. We'll have Q&A right after the speaker. And then, as we do in every other session, we'll break up to small working groups to digest and discuss the materials with a couple of questions, suggested questions from the speaker. We have already outlined 3 sessions for this semester. On October 13, we are going to have Nimrod Aloni. On November 10, Esteban Villalobos and colleagues will present work from Chile. And on December 8, Nancy Kendall and colleagues will present work that they're doing as well. If you're interested in sharing your work at the workshop, please feel free to contact us, Oren or Daphne, and we are more than happy to schedule a session with you for the spring semester. But now I want to move to our speaker of the day, Dr. Anita Bakshi, who's going to talk about Our Land, Our Stories project, Superfund and Indigenous Land in the United States. Anita Bakshi is the author of Topographies of Memories and New Poetics of Commemoration, 2017 from Palgrave. Following several years in architectural practice, she received her PhD in History and Theory of Architecture from Cambridge University with the Conflict in Cities Research Program. She now teaches at Rutgers University in the Department of Landscape and Architecture. Her research focuses on contested landscapes and histories, environmental justice, and the relationship between architecture and inequality. She engages in design research and explores new forms and processes of memorialization. She has published articles in the Journal of Urban Design, eFlux Architecture, Journal of Landscape Architecture, Memory Studies, and International Journal of Islamic Architecture. Recent publications include the book, Our Land, Our Stories, and Contaminated Representations. And I will share a link to her beautiful website on the chat in a minute. Anita, the floor is yours. Welcome to the workshop.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Very much appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to share the work from the Our Land, Our Stories project, and also to I'm most excited about the working group breakout sessions to be able to share or hear some of your thoughts and ideas on some of the questions I'm going to pose, because we're moving into a new phase of the project and kind of working on a second edition. So hopefully you can all see my screen. If not, let me know. I thought I would start by just introducing where the places that I'm talking about. So the Our Land, Our Stories book focuses on Ringwood, New Jersey, which is located, you can see, right on the border of New Jersey and New York State. It is a Superfund site, and I'll talk a little bit later about what that is. It's essentially a highly contaminated site that the United States Environmental Protection Agency has made a commitment to clean and to remediate. It's also the home to the Ramapo-Lenape Turtle Clan, a Native American community in the ancestral homeland known as Lenapehoking. And because it's a Superfund site, a site that has a lot of contaminants in it, this image I'm showing here is kind of the typical way we might imagine these places to be represented. So what you see here is like a map that shows where remediation has taken place. There's a remediation calendar here that shows what was removed and when. And that's one way of looking at these sites. But what we really tried to do in this project is to make it really clear that it's more than just that. A Superfund site is also home. It's also a place of cultural connection, spiritual connection, traditions. And so the project really is about illustrating all these other layers, and also showing that information in a way that's clear and easy to understand. Because when a lot of people encounter documents about Superfund, they feel almost deliberately opaque, like they're very, very hard and very difficult to understand. So I'll tell you a little bit about the process. So we started working on this in 2018. I taught a design studio at Rutgers Landscape Architecture, and the studio actually focused on how to design memorials to commemorate and mark environmental losses. And that point, I reached out to Chief Mann, who you see in that middle photo over there, the clan chief of the Ramapo Turtle Clan. And so he came into the studio, we visited Ringwood a few times, and he agreed to work with us on the project. I think this is like a page from the syllabus, which is maybe a way to quickly summarize this kind of complex history of this place. So Ringwood was the home. It housed a lot of iron deposits. There was a lot of iron mining that took place in there up until the mid 1900s. And at that time, the Ford Motor Company plant built what was at the time the biggest production plant just a few miles away in Mahwah, New Jersey. A lot of the residue from painting the cars was deposited in Ringwood, in the mines themselves and in the forest, and even ended up in people's backyards. That's how it ended up on the EPA Superfund list. So remediation began in the 80s. They said it was done, it was cleaned up, but it wasn't. There's very obviously contaminants remaining in the area. So for the very first time in the history of Superfund, it was taken off the list and then put back on again in 2005. And then, there's ongoing kind of issues and contestation concerning this community. So sort of in relation to the ability of federally recognized Native American tribes to operate casinos. The Ramapo, by the way, are not federally recognized, they're only state recognized. And I'm going to talk all about that later on in the talk. But there was worry when they were filing for recognition that maybe they would operate casinos on this land. So Trump sued the federal government in '93, naming the Ramapo in that claim because they were worried about unfair competition to casinos in Atlantic City. And then, of course, you probably know there's ongoing environmental issues with pipelines and things like that running through Indigenous communities all over the country. So it's kind of a snapshot of what the history and what we kind of wanted to look at in the studio. And when that studio wrapped up in 2018, I got a very generous grant from the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, and that's really what's been sponsoring this work. So we created this book, the Our Land, Our Stories book, which is really meant as a resource for teachers, for curriculum, which is why I'm presenting here to you all. It's already been used like in middle schools, high schools, and in a few university classes at Rutgers. And along with that, we also created an exhibit. And this was in the Newark Public Library. And you can probably tell from this image that we were really trying to make the materials very aesthetically pleasing and easy to engage with. Again, to help people to engage with a complicated topic and one that may be difficult. We've had like a number of different community events and panels and speakers. The materials are set up to be very interactive. So this is one of the exhibit boards that people were asked to write on, and then it continues to travel with it. There's also a piece like this in the book itself if teachers want to use this interactive component. And then what we've been working on for the second edition is gathering through gatherings, asking Ramapo to share stories. And then I've been working with these brilliant sketch artists to kind of like visualize these, and which are going to be added into that second edition of the book. It's important to say that, you know, there has been a lot that's already been done to represent this history and this issue. So there was a major HBO documentary, Man versus Ford, came out in the early 2000s. The Record, a North Jersey paper, did a really amazing investigative journalism series, and they now have an ebook available called Toxic Legacy. But what we wanted to do in this project is really like pull away from the narratives of damage and talk about all these other aspects of you know, how people live with contamination and what that means. So here you see just the chapters of the book. So these are some of the different layers that we were working on explaining and exploring in addition to contamination. And I was asked to talk a little bit today about the history of Indigenous land and a little bit about Superfund. So I'll talk about history and contamination, kind of pulling from those chapters. And then I also want to show some new work that deals with community and this issue of recognition. So I'll start with history. I know some of you from the chat, you mentioned you're calling in from the US, others of you from other countries. So you may or may not be familiar with these different federal laws and policies that impacted what's legally known as Indian land. So I'm not going to talk in detail about all of them, but I want to give you a few highlights of how land has been dealt with by the federal government. So the 1887 General Allotment Act authorized the government to survey reservation land or Indian land and divide this area up into allotments for individuals and families, with lots ranging from 40 to 160 acres in size. And then what happened is the excess or the surplus land was then sold off to non-natives, which is why this is the only reservation land left in the United States. It actually used to look like this. The Great Sioux Nation took up almost all of half of South Dakota. You have all this Indian land in Oklahoma. But through allotment, and I'm showing you here the acres of land that were lost, through allotment, and here you see one of the maps that was used to create these parcels, this land was sold off and it was advertised all over the country as this great opportunity for homesteaders and settlers to take over this land. So that's one issue that really significantly impacted Native American land. Another was a series of laws in the 1950s, which is also known as the termination era, which like HCR 108 declared the intent of the US to abrogate all treaties with federally recognized tribes and to abolish supervision over tribes. So it sounds like kind of a good thing, but what it meant was that several tribes were terminated. A total of 109 tribes lost their recognition, and another law allowed a number of states to assume control over Indian reservation land. So through this process, another 1 million acres of land was lost. You also have policies like the Indian Relocation Act, which encourage Native people to leave their communities and to find jobs in the cities. And then finally, there were a number of acts like this one, which created dams that flooded a lot of Indian land that was used for farming and it was used for labor production. So it really disrupted livelihoods of communities, even if they still were able to keep their land. So this is what, you know, some of what we go over in the history section, and I hope you can all read it later. I know this is a very quick overview, but even though the Ramapo are not federally recognized, I wanted to put that whole context in place of the issues that Native communities are dealing with all over the country. I want to move now to the contamination chapter. And I don't think I have the slide in here, but Native American communities are disproportionately impacted. They live by more Superfund sites and contaminated sites. But in this chapter, part of what we do is just offer a definition of Superfund. So it's land that the US, in the US that's been contaminated by hazardous waste and identified as the EPA as a candidate for cleanup because it poses a risk to human health and or the environment. And once sites are identified, they're placed on the national priorities list and slated for remediation or cleanup. So you can read about, how that whole process works. We have some maps that show you where these sites are located, where, and even also like the hazardous waste landfill, that once things are cleaned up, they don't just disappear, they're moved around to other parts of the country. I live in New Jersey. We have a lot of Superfund sites here. So part of what we're also trying to do is raise awareness, because when I started the project, I was very surprised to find out that a lot of people living in New Jersey with all these Superfund sites here don't know what that means, even though we have so many. So we also, it's not just about this one particular story of this community, but thinking about like broader connections out to other communities as well. And then the last section of the book that I want to talk about is the community section. And so this is a chapter in which I'm actually created a lot of additional work, which I'm asking you guys to take a look at in the breakout rooms. And that's because I mentioned earlier, the Ramapo are not federally recognized, but they're state recognized. And there's been a lot of questioning about their identity and about their rights to claim their Native heritage. And initially working on the book, I thought I could just kind of leave that to the side and look at all these other layers. But as I continue to work with the community, it becomes very clear that this issue doesn't go away. It remains very present, and it affects their ability to get work done and get grants and all these other things. So I wanted to show you a little bit of the new work from this chapter. And here you see this map that you may already have seen that shows Lenape-Hoking and the traditional land of different Native communities. And what I wanted to show in the book is how this community has been portrayed, negative depictions and stereotypes of this community over time. I'm starting here in 1921, but there's newspaper reports that go back to the 1800s about this like savage community of wild people. In 1936, a local historian self-published this sort of pamphlet in which he explains the origins of the Jackson Whites, which is how the community was known locally. And he kind of makes, it's a wild story, it's a real tall tale, and he claims that the Ramapo are really the descendants of Indians, Hessians, prostitutes, slaves, outlaws, this whole tall tale, but it's really taken hold in the local imagination, and it's really informed how people see this community. And then there was a book, an academic book that came out in 1974 that had a major impact on this community, where this author, actually a historian from Rutgers University, makes another interpretation of identity, trying to dismantles the Jackson White Smith, but also says like, oh, but they're actually not really Native Americans. If there was any early Indian ancestry, it probably would have been Lenni Lenape or Delaware, but it probably could not have involved more than one or two individuals, or there would have been more documentary evidence. So what I want to do is I want to, in the book, like look at what that documentary evidence is and how these different claims are supported. So the author, David Cohen, claims that the Ramapo's only real ancestors come from these three free Black families and he documents their movement from New York or New Amsterdam into the region. And he does, good genealogical research, and he traces out these three families, but these family trees and this research ends in the 1700s. That's the last point at which he's able to trace these families. And he also states in the book that gaps in the genealogical records and the fact that the federal censuses for 1790 to 1830 are missing prevent establishing positively the exact relationship between many of these colored families in the mountains and the earlier colored families in the Hackensack River Valley. But in one case, the record is clear. So he essentially admits like the evidence is not really in place. I just know like just this one guy have clear evidence that this one person moved to this region. And so, I want to question here, is that the only documented link in the available record? And is that enough to prove to establish ancestry? Because these three families, these are common last names amongst the Ramapo. So is that enough to make the claim that there's no Native heritage possible at all? And also, he's drawing a lot on these census documents and other colonial documents, and they didn't even record the category of Indian until 1870. Whites and Negroes were the only categories in the census until 1850, at which point mulatto was added, and then later other racial categories were added. So you can't even really rely on that record because those people are invisible. If you're a Native American, you're not going to show up in the census anyway. So here's some of the questions I want to, ask the reader to encounter then. Like, could this have influenced the Bureau of Indian Affairs decision because they were denied federal recognition, even though, many public officials and genealogists have gone on record in support of the Ramapo, and there's also evidence in the archaeological and written record that supports the Ramapo's claims. And also we know that New Jersey state recognition is reaffirmed and made official in 2019 after the state performed the proper genealogical research and considered all of the evidence presented. So what I really want in this new section of the book is for readers and students to think about and encounter these questions, like who decides about identity, what kind of evidence is considered. I mean, it really draws on the colonial record. These census documents and oral histories and traditions are not really allowed in as evidence. And also whose story is told. Who do we listen to? And then finally to make the decision, like, what does the evidence reveal to you? Because there really is no proof, like on either side. There's no, social scientific documents or anything that can prove definitively. So that's kind of what I really want to look at in the next version of the book here. I'll take the next minute or so to just show you some of the new work. This is the new cover. So we're working on, I'm working on rewriting a bunch of stuff and we're adding more material. We're hoping to publish this in July of next year. And what we really wanted to do here is add in our original voice, the stories of the Ramapo. So it's less of me as the academic and like other people who are writing essays explaining things, but we also want to include how people are experiencing this history of contamination and remediation, as well as how public perception, environmental racism, lack of being able to claim what your own identity is, how does that affect the cleanup process and how their land is dealt with? And here I'm just showing you a couple of 2-page spreads in the book of some of the people who shared their stories. This is Ramapo elder Vivian Milligan. And so we have the sketches done and then excerpts from their stories. Here's another community leader, Wayne Mann. Also his stories. So we just hear in original voice with the visualizations to make people want to read about the work. And then we also have another resource. This was finished last year. We're working on revising it now. We have a short video documentary called The Meaning of the Seed. And I'll, in a little bit, I'll put the link in the chat if anybody wants to watch this. And we want that to be part of this kind of packet of teaching materials or curriculum or however people want to use it. And then I'll also share with you our Facebook and Instagram pages. So if you wanted to follow up and keep track of the work that we're doing. And yeah, I think that's all I want to say. Oren already has the questions and the topics that I would love for you all to consider, because we are very actively working on the project now. It would be great to hear from you about how we can improve the work and also about how we can really make it work for educators for the use in the classroom. And I'm putting in some links in the chat here for you all to follow up with. So thank you so much for your time and attention this morning.
Thank you so much, Anita. This was great. What a wonderful start for the workshop. Thank you so much. And I see many people are clapping virtually. So we have time for Q&A before we go into breakout room discussion. So I invite everybody, just raise your blue hand or your regular hand and I'll call you up. So we'll have an organized discussion. Anita, as people are getting ready with their questions, let me ask you, can we share all these links on the website? So if someone is watching the recording, they can also use the links?
Yes, please do. Absolutely. Oh,
Okay.
sorry, it's my timer. I'll just stop that.
Great. Okay, we have one question. Go ahead.
Hello, good day.
Good morning.
Okay, good morning. It's good afternoon here in Nigeria. Thank you very much, Anita, for that presentation. I am actually outside the US, but I understand and appreciate your concern for the environment. And my question is about your project. If I heard you correctly, you said, if I'm not mistaken, that there were no scientific analysis done, maybe like soil sample collection, water collection. I don't know if I didn't get that part, but you might correct me in that aspect. And then this other question is, what was the responses of the local authorities as regards your research? Was there a cooperative attitude rendered to you, support? Was there any form of collaboration, or was there any form of resistance in the findings? Maybe what you were able to come up with, and if they were, how were you able to overcome those issues? I think I'm interested in knowing how it went well with implementing that research that you have taken. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I mean, first I'll just clarify, there have been many studies like of soil and water contamination. Those exist, but like our work has been on making them easier to understand and more approachable. So you can search on the EPA's website or the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection's website, and all these studies are there, but you're basically going to be able to download like a 200-page report that makes no sense to you and doesn't help you realize that there's a possibility that these contaminants could migrate into this nearby drinking water reservoir. So those are the kinds of things where we've really been like not doing new research in that area, but just doing the work of trying to visualize and represent it more clearly. And yeah, that's a great question with the about what the response has been from local authorities. In the Our Land, Our Stories book, there's a short essay written by a former mayor of Ringwood, who was very supportive of the Ramapo and their efforts to remediate the land. And she writes about how when the borough government changed, that support also fell away. And I think she writes in her essay something like the town and the government had failed the Ramapo yet again. So that I think that's more indicative of that experience. It is a pretty marginalized community without a lot of political clout, but they have, caught the attention of many people who can help them. And this is probably too complicated of an answer for this, but the mines are so deep, they go down like 1,800 feet deep into the ground. So the possibility of cleanup is very complicated also because it's very expensive. But the EPA, I think in November of last year, published a record of decision about their plans for the cleanup. And so the plans going forward thus far seem to be to leave the contaminants in the ground and to cap over them to avoid a more expensive clean out, which essentially saves Ford Motor Company a lot of money. So I don't have an uplifting answer for that. It's just sort of disappointing what the response has been, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your response. Please, just one quick clarification, please, if Oren doesn't mind. Okay. Please, did you use any form of video documentation? I noticed from the slides you showed, it's more of like a written text presentation in a kind of room where people could read. Did you take any kind of documentary, maybe with local residents, those that are close or that live in that locality that is being impacted negatively by those pollutants? Maybe sharing their experiences, the negative impacts that these hazardous waste could have or did have on their lives. I think that could be a very clear evidence to use, maybe considering your point of view that there's a lot of research papers and they are not really too convincing. But maybe if you had done videos like that, you could share with us, or maybe take on it if you haven't. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I actually just put the link in the chat to our documentary called The Meaning of the Seed, which we finished in May. And we're just starting to have public screenings and events where we're showing this. So I put the link in the chat for you all, and I'm hoping that it becomes something that teachers can also use and classes can use, because I think you're absolutely right that there's something about the personal encounter with the story that is, it's easier to engage with. And one of the things we do in the short documentary, like the last 10-minute segment of it or so, makes the connection to this particular struggle and this particular environmental justice story and issues that other communities are dealing with. So we're also hoping that you'll watch it and you'll learn about this place and this people, but you might also think about, wait, do we have these issues in my community? Is there a Superfund site near me? And just like be able to engage in that further research on your own.
Thank you so much for the questions, and Anita for the responses. Any other questions?
This is Jason Latchmore from Toronto. I was wondering, did you look more broadly at Indigenous Superfund sites on Indigenous lands? I see you focused on Ringwood, but
yeah, I mean that's not an area that we really cover in a lot of detail in the book. What we do have is a little bit of information. It's actually in an essay that's written by Dr. Judy Zelikoff, sorry. She's a professor at NYU in environmental medicine and toxicology, and she works with, with other Native American communities across the states. And she makes some mention of that work in the essay that she writes. And like very briefly, we just talk about how Superfund, more Native Americans live near Superfund sites than the general population. And there's also, I think it's in the history section, there's a discussion of environmental justice as it relates to Native American communities and Native American land. And in that chapter, we talk a little bit, or in that section, we talk about the situation of the Mohawk in New York State and in Canada, and the Akwesasne Reserve and Reservation, who live near, I think, 3 Superfund sites. There's 2 federal and 1 state. And we also draw some connections to things like the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is not a Superfund site, but about the Army Corps of Engineers Nationwide Permit 12, and how that can be used to like expedite the process of pushing these pipelines and things like that through Indigenous land, just because that's an issue that I think many people have heard of. So we briefly lay out those broader connections, but I love that question because it makes me think about how like teachers could even use this to think about like, well, what's happening in your state or with the community that you work with.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Emily. Emily and then Stephanie. Yeah, go ahead, Emily.
Hi, thanks, Anita, for this. I'm really inspired by your the memorials, and I'm curious about. I guess my perspective is I taught high school in Indiana near a Superfund site. You know, there are many, and you talked a little bit about, and you just mentioned this idea of teachers using this material, and you know, the memorials are such a beautiful way to tap into sort of the grief associated with this. And I'm wondering how you've seen educators, or how you think about it as terms of hope also, as far as like, what do we do with this? Because when I taught, I found it kind of tricky to move past the grief part.
Yeah, I think that's such an important consideration, because I think you can just get locked there then if you're looking at all this, the evidence and the problems can feel sort of insurmountable. So that's kind of why we included the memorials in the book. There's also a section or a chapter called Flora and Fauna that has what I think are just like really beautiful renderings and images that talk about continuity of like, these are the medicinal plants that are still being used. These are ceremonies that are still being done. And what we're doing, and this will be in the second edition, but I really want to focus on adding that in. If you watch the Meaning of the Seed documentary, Chief Mann, who you know, is the Turtle Clan chief that I've been working with quite a bit, talks about this new project. It's the Muncie Three Sisters Medicinal Farm. A little bit earlier, I put a link in the chat to that site, which is a site that they just started about 1.5 years ago. And it's not in Ringwood, but it's farther away. And he talks a lot about how seeds of hope are being planted in this new site. And so I want to focus more actually on that, because I think there's something so uplifting also about growth and plants and building something together as a community. And I think that it's important to, I don't know what the word is, enhance that, so that people can see that. I don't know how did you deal with it in your classes, Emily? Was there something that, like, you know, you saw students able to react to find that?
Yeah, we weren't at that point connected into a broader thing to think about that. So I didn't, which is part of my question, but I'm looking at your the PDF and like the living walls, and you know, building that kind of hope and seed into the memorials themselves. It's an inspiring idea. So thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Hi, so my question actually is a good follow-up to Emily's. I wanted to know, as you were working with the community, you talked about, you know, not wanting to stick to a narrative of damage and trauma and have a more hopeful narrative. Did you find the conversations were very different, speaking with elders versus youth? Did you engage youth in a different way than you would elders, and how did those conversations go?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I think this project also illustrates, like, I don't want to say the limits, but some of the difficulties of trying to do collaborative work, because I think the materials we have gathered are imbalanced in terms of, like, you bring up generational issues, but also, you know, there's always that imbalance of who is showing up at events and who is a more vocal participant. So in the Meaning of the Seed documentary, you'll see that there's one younger person. I don't know his exact age, but he's not even that young. He's maybe in his 30s and 40s. And I've tried to speak to youth and like, you know, get people to show up at events. But I think that there's just, I don't know the reasons for it, but like there's not an interest in that. And it's also that this community has been dealing with this. I mean, this was first listed on Superfund in 83, I think, or 82. You know, so generations have gone through this and are dealing with the same issue. There's the HBO documentary, there's the Toxic Legacy series, there's other depictions. And I don't know if there's also a kind of fatigue about being, worked on and talked to and represented. But that's something I've had a hard time kind of connecting with. It's part of the reason that we started with like kind of a more of a social media campaign as well, like the Facebook page and Instagram page. We just started about a year ago. And that actually has been, we've had some younger people joining and commenting and sharing. So it's a bit more of a passive sort of engagement. But yeah, I hope you, in the breakout sessions and in the discussion, you all might have some ideas to share with me, because I work with, I teach university classes, and a lot of the students are so mature as well. You all may have, different strategies depending on where you're teaching. I would love to hear actually from you all on how I might enhance that going forward with the book. So thank you so much for that, that point.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie and Emily. Is there any question that someone want to ask at this point? If not, I suggest we start the small group discussions where we can delve into the materials that Anita provided. Is that okay with everybody?
Yeah, Oren, I just had a thought. I'm going to appear here. My internet connection is very bad, I'm sorry. In regards to engaging youth, I just had a thought. This might be totally out of like a blab out of my thinking process, but they engage really strongly with their cell phones and apps. And I'm wondering if there's ways that young people who are designing apps could be drawn into designing some kind of app that has to do with engagement with superfans or identifying superfan sites, so that kids that age can have more of a interactive engagement with this, even if it's virtual, into the whole process and situation of what a superfan means. So that was just a thought. I'm throwing it out there. I don't know if anyone has connections, but I'm sharing.
Yeah, no, that's a great thing to think about. I think one thing we're also going to try and do in the work that we're doing on the documentary going forward is we're going to try to interview someone from the Sunrise Movement. And like maybe it'd be good also to ask about like, what are your engagement strategies? How do you, I don't know. I think we have so much to learn from all these other organizations.
Great. Thank you, Bibi, for the suggestion. And Anita, if you're interested in connecting with someone that is doing this kind of work with apps and kids, we have actually a colleague at the college that is doing that. I'm more than happy to connect you. So thank you, Bibi, for the suggestion. I suggest we move to breakout room session. Anita, can you share again the Google Doc so people will have it? Anita was kind to prepare a Google Doc with a couple of questions that she is suggesting that we explore in the group discussions and some additional materials. Each room, we're going to have 3 rooms. So room 1, Anita, I'm going back to your original idea. Room 1, please focus on first question. Room 2, focus on the second question. And room 3, focus on the third question. I think that way we'll have interesting discussion coming back. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I'll let everybody come back and then we'll start, I suggest, with a quick report from each group. Anita is really curious about our discussion and she would like to hear more from us. And then I hope that we have enough time until 10:30 to also maybe have some conversations and a healthy debate. Okay, so who would like to give us a snapshot of what happened in room number 1?
Hi, I'm happy to give a brief update. So our question was about how the materials could be used in the classroom. And we had a few ideas on this. So the first thing that we thought was that as it was in the format of a story, this gave it real power as it could be related in different ways. We also thought that the theme of empowerment was really important as well, as that sort of, it allows hope to breed. And there was different ways to do this. So for example, with older students, it could be helpful to encourage real world engagement rather than it being abstract in the classroom, and then developing real skills to do so. And as part of that, there was a re-emphasis on the technology as a really important tool that young people are familiar with, allows voices to be amplified and can reach actors further away. And the story format was also helpful as it allowed examination of the issues from a slight distance. If it was perhaps a student's immediate context, there could be some risk of trauma there with difficult issues in their immediate environments. We thought that younger children, these materials could be used with younger children to help develop a broader civics. So an example of this would be that they could role play the situation and take on sort of characters in the story and see the situation from different angles. And that this was also another way of connecting with the people in the story. And I think what came out as important was that retaining focus on the people involved in the story was really important, rather than it spinning off in just a purely environmental lesson or just looking at Superfunds. So an example of a way to do this was to imagine what the land would be like if it stayed in the hands of the people, and perhaps by doing that, thinking about what are the fundamental aspects of indigeneity that would inform how that land would look if it had been retained and unchanged. Also, suggestions to invite the Ramapau people to engage with the curriculum and the learning actively. And another idea was to sort of maintain focus on the culture and history of the tribe by, for example, creating a mural or memorial. And then, just a final idea about how it could also be applied to different parts of the curriculum. So obviously science and also perhaps art as well. So it could be used as in a jigsaw activity with different groups doing one part of a sort of, a sci-fi graphic novel portraying the story and then bringing it together. So that was just a few of the ideas we had.
Thank you so much. I'm taking notes furiously. That's fantastic.
Thank you, Gareth. And room 1. Virginia, I see your hand.
Yes, I just want to suggest a play. Let kids create a 10-minute, 15-minute play and let them decide how the future is going to be. Now we can have groups of kids create different plays and they decide how the future is going to be.
Great. Thank you so much. Room number 2, who would like to share with us? I don't know who was there.
I was there and I can give a brief rundown. So our question was more about the pages in the spread and just looking through those. And what we came up with is that just a few suggestions. It may be helpful to have a roadmap for students in terms of how to engage with the material. So guiding questions. And also we found that sometimes it was really hard to follow the flow of the pages. So do they need titles or subtitles and kind of groupings and scaffolding in that way? We were thinking about different techniques around like self-reflection and positionality of investigation for the learners themselves. So how might this information and story connect to the ways that you understand your neighborhood, your life, your family, and your history? And perhaps using exercise around genealogy, though that may be sensitive depending on the learner. We also had an idea of using rivers. So for example, I grew up in Morristown, New Jersey, and this river, the one that you investigate, comes and flows right into the Whippany River. And I have memories of the Whippany River being the color red. So I wonder to myself if there's a way of using rivers as a theme to show interconnectedness and to connect learners to this local story. And even asking the question, like, what are the rivers in your life as a student? And what are your Superfund sites? What are the things that poison your rivers? And how do you connect global and local events that relate to this history? So perhaps using other kinds of news stories that relate to this story as a way to engage learners into this particular story. And Ringwood, perhaps engaging learners with learning the indigenous names of the land and the natural fauna and features as a ways of connecting and knowing that there are other ways of calling things that have histories unto itself. They're not just colonial legacies. And the last thing we talked about briefly was the circling of pages, and just in terms of can sometimes feel like a detective doing an investigation, and it perhaps can appear dismissive and disinterested, that it's just going through documents and circling things. So we don't, it can be exciting, but also I wonder if it can feel like it's cursory. It's not really an in-depth look. So I'm wondering just in terms of an aesthetic. And then the final question we had was about age appropriateness, is that how do we make this material age appropriate for different learners and different kinds of learners who have different ways of learning. And those are some of the topics that we talked about with this.
Wow, thank you so much. That's that's really helpful. Like this is very much just in the beginning phases. So hearing this now really gives me a lot of direction. The idea of rivers as themes of connection is something I really want to think about. You know, we're doing we're adding some new material to the Meaning of the Seed documentary, which currently has 4 sections. So it's soil, seed, growth, and sunlight. So we're trying to like talk about the, you know, from the soil to the canopy. And with the new materials we're adding in, that I'm also thinking about how rivers can be like a way that we interweave things throughout these different panels. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Darren. And room 2, and then last, room 3. I'm not sure who would like to speak. It's not going to be me. Virginia, may I ask you to share the thoughts we had? Or Emily? Or Kelsey? Here you go. Emily, go ahead.
I can try. We were asked to read the preface, and so it's a wonderful read, and there was a lot in there. So we actually struggled a little bit with like, oh, but then there's this and then this, and also trying to get to the questions that you asked. And you can see in our notes, so I'm not sure I'm going to represent a lot more than what's in there, but this trying to balance the complexity of the situation and the uncertainties with maybe the purpose of the book, or how you want students and teachers and others to use it. And so we sort of struggled with that ourselves, right? And thinking about what makes sense for that. One of the suggestions was rather than it all just being your voice, even though the whole book obviously is all about including the community voices, figuring out how to might be able to do that in the preface. And then thinking about maybe there's other places to have some of that controversy or uncertainty rather than in the preface, and the preface can just simply be more about what you want people to read or to take away. And Oren raised the point that in climate education, one of the struggles is that the uncertainty of climate science, or the perceived uncertainty of climate science, really sort of muddies the waters. And so that was where some of that came from. So feel free to jump in, anybody else, if I didn't capture it all.
It is also, we talked about the questioning for, the epistemological question about how important voices are. And we should never, or at least try to avoid the uncertainty that these voices are not valued. So that their truth is the truth. And even though, it's their voices. So you're trying to give voice to the voiceless. So this uncertainty, the cloud of uncertainty, we have to try to avoid.
Yeah, thank you so much for those comments. I've been just struggling and grappling with how to introduce that issue, because it feels like not addressing it doesn't work, because there is this doubt out there in the public discourse. So I was like, do I tackle this head on right in the beginning of the book? But it's sounding like from room 3, you're feeling like it's not the place to do that, and as the introduction to the reader at that point. Yeah, thanks so much for pointing that out.
Wonderful. And we have 6 minutes for more Q&A and discussion. So please go ahead.
Hello. Hello, thank you very much for your presentation and for the opportunity you gave us to discuss some really interesting stuff. Just something I thought, and from an outsider's perspective, because I live in the United Kingdom, I'm not in the US kind of context, but it really surprised me, the term Superfund. And I think the actual word can provide all sorts of interesting insights for a conversation, or for something in class to do with students, or even I was wondering whether you are giving it any deeper thought and discussion in the book. So for instance, I think Superfund, the way you presented it, I assume that it is a term that has been given by some officials, I get from. So why did they call it Superfund? It's something that deserves a Superfund. It has such a positive connotation that it perplexed me, and I think it's. I'm just asking if there is anything in the book that you're thinking of further addressing. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I mean, I haven't really given that much thought, but I will say, like, just as an anecdote, many times when I mention, oh, I'm working on this thing with the Superfund site, people think super fun. Yay, how awesome. And yeah, that's it. I guess I just take it so for granted. I haven't really reflected on why it has that title, but that definitely is something to think about. Why make it sound so positive? Yeah, so thanks for that. I'm gonna reflect on that.
I have a question, Nita, if I may. I'm curious to know what you think would be like the optimum outcome here. Like what would be a really good outcome here? What should we be aiming to do or accomplish?
You mean from the perspective of helping the situation, like the environmental contamination situation, or for you as teachers?
I suppose both. Like what would help? Yeah, how could we? What would be the best outcome for the actual situation itself? And then I suppose, yeah, what would you see learners leaving school? What sort of competencies, if you like, or knowledge or skills you think they'd have that would be important to help achieve that?
Yeah, I mean, I think with this particular site, I don't know what is going to change because the cleanup is so complicated. So I don't know if getting, spreading awareness about the site is necessarily going to change it. But my hope is, I didn't really talk a lot about the water chapter, but these contaminants that are way deep down in the ground are really close to this major drinking water reservoir. So one thing that I want is, like, even if you don't care about this community, even if you have no, sense of like what they may be going through, that, you also just have the realization that this is by your water and it's near your community. I think maybe I'm a little bit too of a pessimist, or like too jaded to think that this is necessarily going to trigger a change that's going to be, instrumental in getting the site cleaned up. But, I mentioned like the Muncie Three Sisters Farm. The Ramapo are also, they've been in negotiation with the state of New Jersey for a while to gain access to another site and other land. And so I hope that, also, and this is kind of getting to the second part of your question, that one thing that can be communicated and taught is the importance of land and connection to the land and access to land for this community, for Native American communities, like for, cultural traditions, and also for recovery of lost knowledge. So there's a lot of active cultural restorations, not just in New Jersey, but across the state. I mentioned earlier the Akwesasne Mohawk people, and to, think about in some way what land back could mean, you know, in a practical and, you know, very active sort of way. And we can talk about it as this like kind of like very large idealistic project, or we can also think about like, how do we get started right now with giving access to land and to these like restoration projects. And yeah, also more broadly, I just hope you all share the resources with any teachers, classrooms, colleagues who you think might be interested. Where like the reason I'm working on that, you know, this whole new revisions to the book is that I'm also wanted to make it more comprehensive and have a really thorough like history section in the book, because I'd like to approach a real publisher with the book, just so we can, you know, have more spread and dissemination and, you know, get this out there and have a wider reach. So if anyone has any thoughts, ideas, suggestions, please email me. I guess I should. I know Oren's probably needing to wrap this up here, so I'll just stop talking by putting my email in the chat. So please do be in touch with any thoughts and suggestions. And thank you for your contributions through this discussion.
Okay, thank you so much, Anita, for a wonderful presentation, and thanks everybody for your participation today. This was a great first meeting. I can't wait for the second one in October with Nimrod Aloni. We're going to talk about eco-humanism, right? That's the title, eco-humanism. And I hope you will join us then. Please share the links and emails about our workshop with your colleagues and students. We want to see more people joining us. It's always nice to connect with new people. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a wonderful week.